The numbers and the headlines, it's really a tally to activate people's emotions because their emotions are coded or programmed by a certain moral premise.
This is what Hamas wants. And for them, sacrificing people is an honor. It's an honor to be sacrificed. It's an honor to be part of the sacrificial process of creating this Islamic State.
If this is a morality that is the strongest weapon that an entity such as Hamas has, wouldn't this be a good reason for everyone to actually question this morality? Whenever I visit Athens these days, I notice a disturbing trend in the political graffiti on the walls. Usually you would see things like Free Gaza and Free Palestine. That's okay, we're used to that in Greece. But then it escalated to slogans such as End Zionism. And lately I even see calls to kill Zionists. And this is not just some crazy people writing graffiti. In the Greek islands, there are almost daily protests targeting Israeli tourists. And there are campaigns declaring that, quote, genociders and baby killers are not welcome in Greece. And I've been asking myself, what could lead people who see themselves as progressives to sound like we're back in Nuremberg of 1938 with the Jew hate? Well, the answer becomes clearer the moment one turns on the news. Because day after day, the reporting from Gaza sounds like a Hamas press release. So you turn on the news and it's usually, today Israel killed X number of children, and today Israel killed X number of workers, and Israel continues pounding a starving population for 22 months in a row. That's it, that's the news. And if I didn't know better, and if this was my only source of information, I would be furious too. I would be angry too. So today, on the Ayn Rand Institute podcast, with my colleagues Elan and Tristan, we will explore why the media coverage of this war is unlike anything in the history of war reporting, and what are the consequences for our culture and for the public sphere out there. So, Elan, I don't know if I exaggerated when I said I've never seen something like that, but the truth is I've never seen something like that. I've never seen such a one-sided presentation reporting from a conflict.
Yeah, I think we should unpack, is it really unique in history? And just as a spoiler alert, I don't think it's unique in that previous rounds of fighting between Israel and the Palestinians, Israel, Hamas, Israel and the Hezbollah forces in Lebanon, I think we've seen similar things. And I think it's really disturbing. I think it's well worth analyzing. And so this is a follow-up to some of the discussions we've had on previous episodes of the podcast, where we looked at news reporting about this conflict in particular, and other analysis of the rise in anti-Semitism. And I think this interacts with the kind of issue you're raising here, which is there is a more salient form or brazen form of anti-Semitism of the kind you're describing in this political graffiti that you saw in Athens. Why don't we turn to the article that really triggered this conversation? Because I know you read it, I read it, Tristan read it. It's really striking, and I think it provides an interesting window into this phenomenon. So why don't you tell us a bit about this article, Nikos?
Yes, this article appeared in the Associated Press. So it didn't appear in Al Jazeera, it appeared in the Associated Press, somewhere where you turn to for supposedly objective information. And the article was a piece that appeared a few days ago, and its title is Survivors of Israel's pager attacks on Hezbollah struggle to recover. So it is an article presenting the pain and the trip to recovery, the journey towards recovery of some people who were injured in the pagers operation, you remember, by Israel almost a year ago, that targeted people from Hezbollah. And the interesting thing is that the article acknowledges that even according to Hezbollah, even according to the Islamists in Lebanon, even according to Hezbollah, most of the people who were wounded and killed were Hezbollah fighters or Hezbollah personnel. So the article does not claim that, this was an indiscriminate attack, although they claim that, some people claim it was indiscriminate, but the article says we mostly are going to talk with people who were indeed personnel of Hezbollah or actual Hezbollah members. And yet, although it tells us it will do this, it focuses mostly on some women and children who were around Hezbollah fighters who were injured. And I'll be honest with you, seeing these pictures and reading these stories, I felt pain, particularly for the kids and for the women. But there was something major missing from the article. What was missing is informing us about what is Hezbollah. And when someone joins Hezbollah, what is he signing up to? So what is the nature of this entity, Hezbollah, on which the pages exploded? And what we found about Hezbollah in the article are the following. Quote, it says at some point, Hezbollah has been firing rockets into Israel almost daily for a year in solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza. So that's what we hear about Hezbollah. They fire some rockets in solidarity. So Hezbollah are people apparently with a developed sense of solidarity. Later in the article, we read that Hezbollah is a major Shiite political party with a wide network of social institutions. That's what it is, right? So Hezbollah, according to the article, is people who show solidarity, and there are some activists. It's a party and it has some activists, maybe like the Republican Party and Greenpeace activists. And then it continues. Hezbollah, it says, it's something, it offers health and religious and social and commercial services in parts of Lebanon and in parts of Beirut. And at the end, to sum up this atmosphere of sorrow for these social activists who got injured, it said that the group is left with a financial but also with a psychological burden because many of its people need long-term medical treatment and recovery. So this is the sad story that we read about these social activists. Now, of course, what we didn't read in the article, and which is the most important information about Hezbollah, is that Hezbollah is a movement that has as its aim, openly, the eradication of Israel. So we're talking here about a genocidal movement. And a movement that has put these genocidal goals to practice. It has attacked Israel many times it has engaged in terrorist attacks, but all we see in the article is that they fire some rockets in solidarity with the Palestinians. We didn't read in the article that Hezbollah was planning October 7 style attacks. And also, we didn't read in the article that Hezbollah has as its goal the establishment of a theocratic dictatorship. So I think what the Associated Press did is absolutely scandalous. Think about it this way. Imagine in 1945 a sympathetic interview with injured soldiers from the Waffen-SS, with the elite troops of the Nazis, and a few maybe innocent bystanders who were injured when they were by them. So these sympathetic interviews with the SS, without mentioning that the Waffen-SS, what they did, who they were, and why did the Allies fight them, and why did the Allies wanted to go after them with all they got. So I'll be honest with you, Elan and Tristan. When I first saw this, I saw this on Twitter. I thought it was like a Babylon Bee article or something else. I thought it was a farce. It cannot be that here we see a sympathy article to Hezbollah without even mentioning who Hezbollah is and what Hezbollah does.
I have a lot to say on this article because I think it is representative of what happens to someone's mind when they take the dominant moral thinking and act on it and shape their thinking that way. So that the dominant moral view that this article is exhibiting is what Ayn Rand called altruism. And it's in many layers in this article. It's both in the focus on the victims and not the alleged victims, the Hezbollah people and their families and some of their families. It's also in the graphical treatment. So you said the article really found it affecting. I did too. I looked through the whole thing and there's horrific photos of people with missing fingers and eyes and bad skin down. Of course there are. There are people like that in war. There's nothing to revel in. But the critical thing, as you're pointing out here, is it's a view of focusing on the victims, regardless of why they're victims, regardless of what their motives are, regardless of any sense of justice, cause and effect, and their own aims. So as you were highlighting, what is Hezbollah about? It is a related organization that is aligned with Iran and wants a theocracy. Not even mentioned here, which is, I think, just to add to what you're saying. So you've pointed out the ways in which it's omitting Hezbollah's hostility, and not just since October 7th. Hostility going back to the 1980s, so 40 plus years of hostility towards Israel. What's missing here, and you would think this would be relevant for any journalists in Lebanon on the ground talking to these people, is the devastation that Hezbollah has caused to Lebanon and Lebanese people. I mean, Lebanon is basically a failed state. I mean, it doesn't have a functioning society. Hezbollah is the shadow government. It has some influence over the official government. It's gone in and out of government cabinets, but it's devastated the country. Lebanon used to be, Beirut used to be, I think its nickname was the Paris of the Mediterranean. And what Hezbollah has done to Lebanon is gut the country, is empty it of all of its modern Western, the best features of what that society was. And it's no surprise that there are Lebanese people who fled Lebanon over the last decades precisely because of Hezbollah. So Hezbollah is an evil organization, not only because, and especially because of its hostility to Israel, which I think is important to what you're raising here, but also to the people it is now dominating in southern Lebanon and other parts of the country. That's missing. How can you write a story like this? The second piece of this is a lot of the news reports that people have pointed to since October 7th that have been biased or misrepresented or completely false. Like there's other things we should talk about here. Some of those are the news just happens and they put up an article and it's in the minute reporting. And there's an argument for saying, yeah, some of that can happen in a war. There's uncertainty about what's actually happening. This is not that kind of article. They spend weeks chasing down these Hezbollah operatives and hours and hours of interviews. So this is not we got the title wrong, we misrepresented the numbers of injured people because it was all in the fog of war. They had time, they had resources, and they went out of their way to get these special interviews and they tell us, it's really important to tell us that they didn't have any minders from Hezbollah telling them what to do. They didn't have any questions were off limits. It was completely... Now, when that's the form of the article, it gives you full visibility into the motivations behind the thinking of the journalists who do it. And so their view is what really matters here, and the only thing to think about are the people who lost fingers, who lost their vision, who are victims here. And doesn't matter why, doesn't matter that they signed up to an organization that is nihilistic, that wants to destroy what is good about Israel and what is good about Lebanon, that is fundamentally, and this is, I think, the key issue here, it is fundamentally anti-Western. What does it mean to create a religious Muslim theocracy? It means to take people backwards in time to a society that is primitive, destructive of individual rights, destructive of individual happiness, and hostile to any kind of progress, whether material or spiritual. That is what Hezbollah represents, just as Hamas represents it in the same way, just as Iran represents it. And that's what these people are being showcased. These are the victims. These are the people who should be victims, precisely because of what they signed up for, because of what their aims are. And in fact, I have no sympathy for them. So there's one other point here to raise, and I'll just flag it and we can dig into it if you're interested. The other kind of omission here is, why isn't there any comparable story here, any comparable account of the people in Israel who are the victims of Hezbollah, or the people in Israel who are the victims of Hamas, who are truly victims because they had no part in this? And why is there no interest in them? And I think this reveals another dimension of the way in which this reflects the altruist perspective, which is altruism tells you it's not, as most people think, about being nice to others, benevolent, or even giving to charity. I don't think that's essential to what altruism is about. Altruism is about sacrificing, destroying the good precisely because it's the good. If you've achieved something, give it away. If you haven't achieved something, that gives you, and this is Ayn Rand's phrase, this gives you a passkey to being the moral elite. And you're above reproach, basically. You're like Caesar's wife. Nothing can be said about you, no criticism can be leveled against you. But if you are actually good, if you represent values that are pro-human life, you don't count. Nobody should care about you. You're strong, you're able, you're economically advanced, you're scientifically advanced. All of that is a sign of either vice or suspicion of vice. And you certainly don't count morally. And so where are the stories about Israelis who are displaced from their homes because of rocket fire from Hezbollah and rocket fire from Hamas? What about the injured people who survived the Nova attacks? Why isn't there this comparable coverage? So this to me is both in its coverage, in the gruesome photographs that it's showcasing, in its omissions. I think it's just a case study of what it looks like when your approach to an issue is completely shaped and therefore distorted by altruism, this morality of self-sacrifice. And to me, this is a key to what Ayn Rand has such a distinctive view here. So altruism, as many people think of it, it's not about lifting the poor and the weak. It's about cutting down the strong and the good, precisely for that reason. There's no upside to the weak and the poor. And this is an example of it.
And let's make something clear, Elan and Tristan. This is not giving voice to the victims. I would be very open to reading an article that would say, hey, in this operation, there were also some children hurt. And this is what happens when you live in a culture, in a society that celebrates war and wants to start wars and wants to eliminate its neighbors. And when are we going to have peace there? When will people like the people in Hezbollah, when they are going to accept that Israel is there to stay? This would give voice to the victim, saying, okay, and part of this operation, some innocent kids were but there's nothing like that. There's nothing like that. The kids are presented in the same way as, if you remember the article, this priest who was like one of the priests of Hezbollah, intellectual leader or something, and in the same way that the Hezbollah fighter who was about to go to a mission when the pager exploded, they are all presented in the same way as victims. So if the Hezbollah fighter is a victim and the kid is a victim, then the idea of the victim is eliminated, and it's not us who are doing the elimination, it's the people who wrote the article. But one more thing here. One could say here, okay, you guys found the most extraordinary outlier article of the one example of bad journalism, and now you're making a big deal out of this. But this is not the case. This is not the only article, and this type of articles are not a mistake. It's not, quote, oh, I'm not a good journalist. Because you mentioned Ayn Rand. The quote that came to my mind is, mistakes of this size are never innocent. Remember a few weeks ago that this horrible, I don't know how to call it, slander, that 14,000 babies will die in 48 hours. And this piece of quote-unquote news flooded the news and our timelines on our social media. 14,000 babies will die in 48 hours. How can it be a human being with some mind who can believe this? Like, why is it going to happen in 48 hours? What's going to happen in 14? How do we know it's 14,000 kids? Like, this is obviously a story which is a false story, as it was proven to be. And yet it was reproduced time and again. Is this a mistake? Or do you remember early on in the war, when a bomb fell on the Gaza City hospital, and within minutes, we were told two things, that number one, Israel bombed the hospital, and number two, 500 people died. And this traveled throughout the news and it traveled throughout the social media. Of course, it wasn't Israel that threw the bomb. Turns out it was another Palestinian organization. It just misfired, and the victims were not 500. But the question that every journalist with some integrity would ask is, how can it be that so quickly we have a reliable estimate of casualties? And who gave us this estimate? Oh, it's Hamas. So are we trusting people with their data about casualties, people who some weeks ago were executing families in front of their children and they were kidnapping babies and doing all types of horrible things? These are our sources and we're going to believe it? Like, I remember after 9/11, it took months to the US authorities with the best technology to estimate the number of victims. And in Gaza, we see there is an attack, and within a few minutes, Hamas comes up with a number. And the journalists keep reproducing it. We've seen the fiasco with the hospital, the fake news. We see such fake news coming out of Gaza every day, which makes sense because if your source is Hamas, what do you expect? And yet the journalists do this time and again. Can this be a mistake? Could it be a mistake that the New York Times a few days ago had this photo, this tragic situation with that kid that it looked in a horrible position, which we were told is starvation. And then when it was proven that it was not starvation, the kid had a pre-existing condition, what does the New York Times do? Instead of putting on their front page, or at least somewhere on their website, that, hey, this story that became the poster kid of the supposed famine in Gaza, this story that created a wave of anti-Semitism in the world, this story was a mistake. We misunderstood what happened. Instead, they tweeted it in one of their secondary accounts, which has a few thousand followers. We said, well, we missed something with that story. Is this a mistake? Is this a mistake? It cannot be a mistake. So the question that bugs me, and I don't know if one of you can help me figure it out, what are these journalists after? Like, do they wake up in the morning and they think, how can I hurt Israel? I don't think it's that. What is their mode of operation? That's what I'm trying to figure out. That's what I cannot understand. Don't they see that they're destroying the reputation of their profession, their integrity as journalists? So what are they after? That's the question I can't find the answer to.
So I think there's actually a good segue here to the next topic. And I think part of it is picking up on something you brought up earlier, Elan, which is you briefly mentioned it in passing, the anti-causal or the non-causal aspect of the way altruism causes people to look at things. And by that, I mean what we've just been talking about, that people evaluate this conflict by just hearing about numbers of civilian casualties or looking at photographs of people suffering. And from those numbers or from those photographs, they deem themselves to have a sufficient understanding of the moral sides of this conflict without understanding what's the nature of each of these parties, each of these participants. What is each of them actually trying to do?
I'm just going to add to this. So you're asking, could this really be a mistake? And I agree. I don't think when it's a pattern, there's a mistake. It's not credible that all these journalists are just shoddy. Mistakes do happen in journalism, that's for sure. But I think you're right. There is a pattern here. I think it integrates with what we've been talking about. And one way to look at this is it's a pattern that is startlingly driven by emotions. So this relates to your point about it being non-causal. It's not about cause and effect, justice, or who's done what, who's instigated the war, who's initiated it, who's the victim. That's causal thinking. That's thinking about who's responsible here. Responsibility is a part of thinking in terms of cause and effect. And this is a fundamental issue in life. And what we're seeing is, and this goes to your point about the numbers and the headlines, and also the way you introduced this, Nikos, where it's X number of babies being killed, X number of... It's really a tally to activate people's emotions, because their emotions are coded or programmed by a certain moral premise. And the moral premise is the weak are the ones we have to care about, and the suffering are the ones we have to care about. The ones who are strong, who cares? Well, don't tell me about that. I don't want to think about that. I don't want to even think about why someone's weak and poor and helpless and suffering. I don't want to think about that. I just want to know who's suffering more, and the more they suffer, the more they have a moral standing. And I think that's part of why the journalism operates that way. So that's one piece of it. But I think the other piece of it, and this is something that came up in a conversation in a previous podcast that you had with Onkar, Nikos, some time ago, which I happened to rewatch that because I was interested to see what you guys talked about. And this was also connected to the media coverage. Onkar made the claim, which I think is really strong and also credible, that I think he's right on this, is that there's in the same way that people's emotions are programmed by altruism to gravitate to who's suffering more. And that's the way to understand the conflict. And that it can't be that they're innocent Palestinians, that the Palestinians are not innocent, because they're innocent means they're the ones who have the moral standing and they're the ones who are suffering. Ergo, they're innocent. It can't be that Israel's innocent. So there's that kind of distortion. But I think the way it operates in part with the journalists is they're not interested in the good. they're blind to it and they're hostile to it. And the more that to think about what Israel's moral standing is here is not interesting to them. And what they're interested in is who's cutting down Israel, who's pushing it back. And sometimes they're frothing at the mouth, hostile to Western civilization type people. I don't think they're all like that. I think sometimes it operates as a emotional background, like a climate, a sort of intellectual climate in their mind, where what they really care about is showing how Israel's bad. And the fact that Hamas and Hezbollah are around is useful because, yeah, let's focus on them. And that requires evading, pushing out of mind the character and goals of Hezbollah and Hamas and the Palestinians who support them and the Lebanese who support them. So that's to me, you're asking, is this an innocent mistake? No, I don't think it's innocent. And I also don't think it's a mistake. I think it's a reflection of how corrupting altruism can be. And it drives towards something else. It doesn't end with just being concerned with the weak. It drives as a pattern towards being hostile to the good. And here I mean good as in creating real values in life and achieving things and being interested in growth and trade with people and peace, all the things that make human life possible. The more you take seriously the idea that virtue is defined by sacrificing values, the more you'll be hostile to those who create values. And I think that's part of what you're seeing here. This is the hostility to Israel, not because it's Jewish, not because it is in some sense religious or ethnically Jewish, but precisely for the reasons that it is good, which is it's more individualistic, it's more Western, it's more rooted in science and freedom, and those are its virtues. And for those reasons precisely, Hamas and Hezbollah are hostile to it. And I think that's also where there's an affinity with many journalists. Like, they don't like those values. They've been taught that though everything Western is bad, it's the source of all problems in the world. And this is just fitting into that framework. And I think that's part of what makes this a pattern. So I've been arguing that the Hezbollah and Hamas are both fundamentally anti-Western. Maybe you could just flesh out for us, Tristan, how you think of their political, ideological vision, just to give us a concrete sense of that.
Yeah, and this is really helpful, I think, and important for supplying some of the causal context that we were just talking about is missing from how a lot of people think about it. And really what is fascinating and really quite horrifying is the extent to which Hamas's ideology is explicitly anti-Western and really wants to destroy and eliminate what aspects of Western society that Palestinian Arabs could otherwise have. And really, if you look at the history of Hamas, so Hamas was originally came from the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, and they were the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood really came about at a time during the British imperial era in Egypt and started as a sort of anti-colonial project. But it swiftly morphed into an Islamist project. And by Islamist, I mean an ideology of treating Sharia law, the law of the Quran, as the model for a political society, as how a political society should be based. That means not having equality before the law, not having checks and balances or democratic norms or respect of rights in the way that we normally have in Western societies. It means censorship. It means barbaric and medieval punishments. And it means rule by religious clerics. And specifically, there's one figure that stands out in particular who was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, Sayyid Qutb, who was an Islamic scholar. And he really clearly lays out the ideology that became Hamas's ideology, that Islam needs to be a comprehensive system of life. There's no room for anything outside of it. And in that way of thinking, the anti-colonial project becomes not just we're going to liberate ourselves from external European influence, but now it becomes we're going to create an Islamic form of society that rejects everything to do with Western norms, Western culture, science, knowledge, progress, um, inquiry, even, and obviously self-expression. And this is what Hamas wants. They want to achieve this through a violent jihad. And for them, sacrificing people and is an honor. It's an honor to be sacrificed. It's an honor to be part of the sacrificial process of creating this Islamic State. Um, and it's part of their ideology of jihad that you need to do this. And so when you're thinking about why is Hamas fighting this war that they can't possibly win? Why would they start a war like this? Why would they not allow their civilians to enter what could be called the largest underground shelter system ever created, possibly in the history of warfare? It's because that the sacrifice of civilians is part of a strategy. It's part of, as you were saying, Elan, of using the media war against Israel, but also it's part of their ideology that it's an honor to be sacrificed um, in the pursuit of creating an Islamic State. And in the end, life on Earth is not that important from that ideology. Um, Life on Earth is just a small part of your existence, and there, there really are. Douglas Murray termed them a death cult in his recent book, and that's really the right way to think about it. Is they're a death cult and they worship death, and they're prepared to use it as a tool. And I think it's just one more quick thing to say about this is that this is not, sometimes people frame it as, oh, Hamas, maybe they're a group of psychos that happens, to control Gaza. But they have vast support in the Palestinian territories. It's about 75% of Palestinians who supported Hamas at the time of the October 7th attack and supported the attack. And it's very likely that if they had an election now, they would win again. And people sometimes forget or evade or omit that Hamas was elected, and people knew what their ideology was at the time that they were elected.
One more thing that now that you were saying this philosophical take on altruism, you mentioned that it's altruism is not about helping those who are in need. It's about tearing down those who are more powerful, so to speak. Notice how none of these behaviors by these journalists and these lies, none of these things in any way helps anyone, any innocent Palestinian. Notice how these people do not demand from Hamas, let's make sure this war ends, surrender the hostages. It's almost as if they're perpetuating the suffering by creating this idea that, well, there are two legitimate sides there and they keep fighting and the kids are in the middle and Israel is killing the kids, so maybe we owe more sympathy to Palestinians. This is a war that Israel is never allowed to win, and this just perpetuates the suffering of those who are indeed innocent. And if you really cared about the innocents, the first thing you would want is, I don't want these people to live under Hamas. I don't want these people to live under torturers, under an Islamic dictatorship. And yet you see this is not even an afterthought. This is never brought up in these reports. Like, how are these people's lives under Hamas, even if Israel never existed? Let's say there's an earthquake tomorrow, Israel sinks on the earth. How would the life of these innocent Palestinians, of these kids, would look like under Hamas? No one cares about that.
And I think part of the context of this too is how people think about war has changed, right? So I often think of as an analogy, it's not a perfect analogy, but as an analogy to thinking about a psychotically ideological and suicidal nation that is basically willing to sacrifice their civilians to fight a war until the bitter end. A perfect example of that is Imperial Japan. And like, how did we defeat them? Well, we had to destroy their civilian infrastructure. We had to show them that we were prepared to completely destroy them in order to make them submit, because they were willing to sacrifice every person. and they were using civilian infrastructure militarily. But again, it's the same dropping of context and the same non-causal perspective, because it's an unwillingness to see Israel's actions in self-defense. Like, why are we in this situation? Like, why is this war happening? Like, why did it start? It started because of Hamas. And, you know, if people have made this point, and I think it is valid to make, that if Israel really wanted to destroy the entire Palestinian population, they could do that. Um, why are they, you know, trying to distinguish between civilians and enemies? Why are they sending warnings before they drop bombs? Why are they creating humanitarian corridors? Why are they sending aid? We can actually have a conversation about whether they should be doing those things. But it's clearly not, the discussion around this is clearly not motivated by a causal attempt to like identify what Israel's actually doing and whether what they're doing makes sense as part of fighting a war that needs to be won against a psychotically suicidal and fanatically ideological enemy. And if you had that perspective in World War II, you would not have defeated Imperial Japan. You could not have defeated them on the premise that you can't destroy civilian infrastructure and that constitutes genocide and that's a violation of the laws of war. It would not have been possible. And so, in effect, what people are demanding is that Israel not be able to win this war.
I tend to agree with you. It would be interesting to study which wars have not involved, which successful wars that ended with the victor, the rightful victor, did not involve destroying civilian infrastructure. I think that's sometimes a necessary, if not a frequently necessary condition for disabling the enemy from continuing to fight. So I agree with you. It's incoherent on that basis. I think there's definitely a way in which this is not the kind of thinking that's required to be concerned with morality, rational morality. Moral thinking is causal thinking. It's about causes and effect. How do you achieve certain values? What leads to the destruction of certain values? How do you retain and preserve and flourish as a human being? And this is not that kind of thinking. And I think that's part of what's so egregious about the labeling of this. You mentioned in passing the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, which is a case pending, or I can't remember where it is in the process, but this is brought forward by South Africa. We had an episode of the podcast talking about that when it first came to light some months back. I think this is part of that whole push to, our whole focus is to demonize Israel. It's not, well, what should they be doing? How can they win this war? Because they should be winning this war. And it's too long since they started. And I think there's things to say about why they haven't won. But if anyone who's morally serious, the question in their mind is not, is there a civilian infrastructure that's being crushed in Gaza? That's not the right question. The right question is, why hasn't Israel defeated Hamas conclusively 2+ years into this? And that to me is the tragedy. That's where the focus should be.
And one more thing about Israel, and that's my final point on that I want to say today. I think it's very sad how Israel has shown zero interest in properly communicating any clear message to the world. I've heard more and more people pointing out how Israel hasn't even got an English-speaking representative of the government to inform the world every day what is happening to Gaza, how the war is going, what's the strategic aim, and so on. I remember even in the Iraq war of 2003, even a backward regime, a poor regime like Saddam Hussein in Iraq, every day in the news you would see the American representatives would say X, and then even Iraq would have this guy, if you remember, the comical Ali, this farcical guy who would say, oh, we are destroying the Americans. In every war you see that. For some reason in this war, Israel doesn't care to play this game, which is though an important game. In every war, you need to have a strong message. And Israel is only playing defense. when one of the slanders and the lies of the pro-Hamas side, when it goes too far, then Israel is trying to do some damage control. And something more, one last thing, since I'm in a complaining mode. I see people who are, let's say, on the side of Israel, they defend Israel in a way which doesn't understand that this is a moral conflict. And the only proper defense of Israel is to say, you have two sides. The one side wants a theocracy and actually wants to eliminate every Jew, and the other sides want to have a humane society. Instead, they give other arguments. So, for example, in Greece, now there are more and more conservatives, because Israel has become this kind of culture war thing. Because they want to oppose the left, they take Israel's side. And they say, we are with Israel because Israel is a strategic partner, military partner of Greece, and also Hamas sides with Erdogan's Turkey. Therefore, we have to be with Israel. And I'm thinking, no, you're not going to appeal to any idealistic person by saying we should be with Israel because we are military allies. No, the only reason I care to defend Israel is because Israel fights to survive as a free society, where all the people can live a life which is mostly free, to prosper, to create, and to be happy. That's the only good reason to defend Israel. And that's how Israel should defend itself. And then it does not. And I cannot understand why Israel is not more aggressive in this war to win hearts and minds in the international public opinion.
Well, there's an interesting interview that Sam Harris hosted on his podcast with the journalist Haviv Retzer. And
he makes that point often.
An interesting argument there. Yeah, that there's an element of historically within Zionism of people think that Jews should not have to defend themselves, and there's something demeaning or self-undermining about the project of defending yourself against conspiracy theories and blood libels and unjust accusations and racist remarks. And I think it's quite plausible that there is that cultural element, because I agree that it's striking the lack of self-defense, like on the propaganda front or the information front, and that Hamas's propaganda is totally carrying the day.
I have a slightly different analysis. I'm interested in that podcast. I'll look it up, and I think there is something about Jews as warriors. I think there's sort of a cultural issue there that is worth thinking about, and how there's a discomfort with that. And there was a discomfort with it once Israel proved its strength after the war of 1967. The people's perspective on them was like, you guys aren't victims anymore. You're strong now. We don't know if we like you anymore. There's sort of a well-recognized shift. And I think it's connected to this issue that you're bringing up, Tristan. I actually have a different perspective, because I do see, especially on social media platforms and in some of the publications I do see Israeli spokespersons on various platforms. Hey, we didn't do this. We didn't bomb this hospital. We didn't kill these people. Here are the facts, trying to set the record straight. And beyond that, even prior to this war, there's a well-established effort in Israel for public diplomacy, just to tell Israel's story and vindicate it in the eye of the public, international public community. I don't think it's very good, and I think it's connected to why Israel's war hasn't been effective. And I think that the root is the same in both cases. It doesn't explain everything, but I think it explains most of what I think we're seeing. And I think this is an example of why even a basically good society, the one Israel, which, as you put it, Nikos, it's basically free, and it's designed to let individuals flourish, and that's the virtue that is worth defending in it. It too is shaped and sabotaged by its embrace of altruism. So I think this is an important point. Altruism isn't limited to societies that are shaped by Christianity. I think there's ways in which it's a secularization of religious morality. I think there's ways in which Israel is very Western in that respect. It's accepted altruistic and collectivistic ideas which go together. And here's how they play out. So when you hear insofar as the Israeli have public diplomacy, explaining their position, trying to debunk various news reports and put their position in place. Here's the pattern of what I've been seeing. The pattern is the international voices say Israel is starving the Gazans. This has been true from day one. We heard in the first month of the war, tomorrow thousands of people are going to die because of starvation. That hasn't been true. And so it's been consistently a drumbeat. What is Israel's response? They trumpet the fact that they do give aid. They do allow aid in. And this is not true. We are sacrificial. We are giving aid to our enemies. That's the essential message, even if they don't put it quite like that. And there's a website, and we can put it in the show notes for people to go look at. It's a daily dashboard, a table with graphs and infographics about the number of trucks, the number of tons of aid, the number of airdrops that Israel is daily distributing. So it's acting on the same principles as those who are critical of it. It's accepting the premise of altruism, that self-sacrifice is a good, and saying, no, we are living up to it. Look at the way we're trying to do that with all this aid. So that's part of what I think undermines their public diplomacy, or their attempt to defend themselves in the public eye, because they accept the premise of their opponents, and their opponents are just more consistent, and you can't win on this premise. This is part of what altruism does. It rigs the system against the good. The other piece of this, the other thread, which I think goes to what we haven't talked about on this episode, but we have talked about in other podcasts, is why is Israel still fighting Hamas? Why is the war not over? And there are many military problems with it, but I think that what drives the military failures is that it's been a war that has not been sufficiently self-interested and sufficiently assertive. And the classic example, and this is part of what I think has demoralized the Israelis as a society, which is the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, would take over parts of Gaza, clear it of Hamas people, and then walk away and let the Hamas people come back and take over where they had been eradicated from. So there's a way in which they have a kind of whack-a-mole approach where they clear a neighborhood, then they leave, and then the Hamas people come back. So it's not really defeating the enemy if you're just clearing them out temporarily. And then the ways in which Israel has gone out of its way, and this is something we've talked about, to warn people about bombings and to have leaflets drop and text messages and voicemails. Now, you can make a case that you want to tell civilians to get out of the way, and that's not a new thing in warfare. But the extent to which Israel does this, which again I think is reflective of its concession of this principle of altruism in war, that also reflects, well, you're self-crippling your military by telling the enemy where you're going. And just take another concrete that just came up in the last week as we were preparing for this discussion. There's now a plan on the table for Israel to conquer Gaza. Now, some people understand that to mean occupy Gaza. There's a question of, is it occupy, is it conquer? And this is announced that this is what we're going to do, and specifically how they're going to do it. They're going to go to this neighborhood, and then they're going to round up various people. Why would you give your military plans and make them public in that way? If this is just another example of enabling your own opponents, your own enemies, you're empowering them. So there are two threads here, both about how Israel's fought the war, and I think its approach to the war has been crippled by its acceptance of altruistic principles of conduct in the battlefield, and I think its public diplomacy, or its attempt to justify itself with a moral narrative, is similarly sabotaged by its concession of this principle of altruism and the idea of giving aid to the enemy. So to me, that's part of the tragedy here. Israel is acting on the same premise as its opponents. And the final piece here, which we haven't talked about, and it's worth just noting in passing, which is many people have already pointed out that it's Hamas's advantage, and you made this point, Tristan, that Hamas is willing and eager to sacrifice its people, and to do that whether they are human shields or they're going to starve to death because of the way the war is unfolding. Hamas is both leveraging the way the media is distorted by altruism, by staging false deaths, by inflating the numbers, by making its people seem like the ultimate victims on the planet ever. And it knows that it's doing this, and it knows that the more it plays this, the more advantage it gains in the eye of the public. And that is part of what makes this so morally corrupt. Hamas is gaming the system precisely because this is its ultimate weapon. its ultimate weapon is the morality of altruism, and it's how embedded it is in the Western mind, the mind of all the countries looking at Israel, including Israel. And this is sort of the weapon that Israel has ceded to its enemies. It's ceded to Hamas. And that is crucial to understanding why we're here 670 plus days since October 7th. Hamas is undefeated. Israel is almost a pariah, or is on the verge of becoming a pariah. And the sympathy of the world is not only shifting, but it's basically on the side of the Palestinians. There's talk of a Palestinian state, which is just ludicrous. If ever there was a more ludicrous thing. This is the power of morality, and specifically an irrational morality, in corrupting people's thinking and knowing it. The more you understand the role of these ideas, the more you can make sense of what is just a horrific situation.
Gentlemen, to sum up, what were the main points that I take as takeaways from today? Any discussion on the war by any journalist or any analyst should always keep in mind some questions. These questions should always be the context. First of all, what is Israel doing in Gaza, and how did this war start? Why is Israel even there? Second, what type of entity is Hamas? What is Hamas after? What is their vision? What do they want to achieve? If they have their way, what are they going to do? What did they do on October 7th, and how have they treated the Palestinian people who don't like Hamas's rule? Another question we should always be asking and have in mind: why is Hamas continuing to fight? Why is Hamas still not surrendering? And also, why are there still hostages kept in Gaza? So for me, any journalist who wants to have an integrity and to claim that he wants to represent the truth, these are the questions they should have in mind. And one last thought, Elan, based on what you said, it's a meta point. If a morality, like the morality that you described, the morality of, quote, altruism or of self-sacrifice, if this is a morality that is the strongest weapon that an entity such as Hamas has, wouldn't this be a good reason for everyone to actually question this morality? Like, yeah, we've been told since we were kids that this is the good morality, this is the way to go through life. But if this morality is the strongest weapon, and I would say these days almost the only weapon that Hamas has, if this is not going to make us question altruism, then what will? Final point, book suggestion, because you both emphasize the moral character of this conflict, and I think the best piece of intellectual work that captures this moral character is this book, What Justice Demands, by none other than you, Elan. And I mean, it's in the title, What Justice Demands. It demands that we view this conflict from a very moral point of view. Any parting words from any of you two?
No. Thanks for bringing this up. It's an important topic.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
All the best.